I was curious about that, and I guess it's better that if it's not handled well, then you might not want it to be handled at all, because I could see the dumbing down of this where they essentially take James Holman and make him into Daredevil, the superhero, with the way that he perceives the world. So we'll try to avoid that whole thing. Okay,
exactly.
so you're right. All right, so getting back to his life, I love that fact about going to the crow's nest. So thanks for expounding on that. And so, yeah, let's look on later on where he's getting into his 40s and his 50s. Queen Victoria is now the ruling monarch. Is this where his life starts to become, where he's tied closer to home? And is this where the details of his later travels become murkier because there aren't the same published accounts?
This is where he spends 8 years settling down, doing his best to perform the duties of a naval knight of Windsor, and this is where he literally starts to die, because he finds that the stationary nature of life, the complacency of it, the known quantity of it, simply really makes his health sink in, and he seems to really be wasting away. And this is at the point where, as I mentioned earlier, he ended up having to bring a lawsuit against the Naval Knights of Windsor and against the Crown in general, to say, because what had happened is that they were going to attempt down on him, because the idea is that this is a position for a disabled naval officer, and yet you travel all this time, so you can't be disabled. So what he ended up doing is getting Queen Victoria's personal physician, and also another most prominent physician, who's Peter Roget, who's the guy who wrote Roget's Thesaurus. They examined him, and they said very, very specifically that he has a condition that only responds to a continual change of circumstances. So they basically diagnosed him as having this unique illness that could only be treated by traveling. And so once that was resolved, and the Knights of Windsor gave him the ability, and actually it took Queen Victoria herself to intervene and authorize this, gave him the ability to travel where he wanted. That's when he launched his last series of adventures. And he went off and traveled for a good 20 years. Did not get as far into other continents, but went through a lot of Central Europe, and had many more adventures, and became an old man. And it was, once again, this very surprising appearance that the famed blind traveler would show up in your village, in your town, in your city, and then now he had this long white beard, and there was almost a saintly aspect to him, and he was quite respected. And when he would come back to London, he was quite respected as well. At that time, he was now a member of the Royal Society. He was a member of the Linnean Society. He was, as I point out, Charles Darwin cites his writings in his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. So it was being taken seriously on an academic level, but nobody was interested in reading his books, his popular books anymore. So he wasn't able to find an audience for that. And it went on that he got to a point where, as he got older, all he would do was simply get on the ferry and go to Calais and go to France, just long enough to hear a different language being spoken, to smell different scents of the streets and all, but then he'd get on the ferry and go back in. So his world really, did get smaller, but he still kept trying to have travel be part of it and to continuously challenge himself. And then he eventually moved into a very, very rough neighborhood, the Whitechapel neighborhood in London. And he did that to work on his memoirs. And it was very surprised. People didn't understand at the time, why did he move into this very dangerous, low neighborhood when he had an apartment waiting for him back at Windsor Castle? And I did the research, and I found that it was a rough neighborhood, but it was also the most ethnically diverse neighborhood. It was where immigrants from around the world came. It's where the sailors who came back from their trips were there. And it was the most multicultural, polyglot culture in London at the time. So even though he couldn't travel anymore, he could stick his head out the window and listen to a dozen different languages being spoken. And I found that just to be fascinating.
And sadly, at the end of his life, his biography does not see the light of day. So what are the reasons for that?
Yes, I think I spent 7 years working on this book. And of those, about 4 of them are spent trying to find his much vaunted autobiography. And it does seem to be that his last book was a comprehensive book in which he gave up the idea of writing a travelogue, and in fact did write honestly about what it meant to be blind and about basically his struggle. So it would have been a key manuscript. And I could not believe that I couldn't find it somewhere. But interestingly enough, how did this blind person write? This was an era before there was Braille, era before there were typewriters. Even writing this regular pen and ink at the time wasn't possible because you would simply smudge the ink. And if you didn't know, you couldn't see what you were doing, you would make an illegible mess. So it turned out that he had this unusual device called a noctograph, which was originally used for spies writing behind enemy lines in the dark. And there was a series of, there was a framework of paper, of wood with some wires across it, horizontal lines of wires that were guidelines for him to write on. And he would write with a stylus on what was called carbonated paper, which was paper with a layer of carbon on it. And you would press down, and you would get the image. Well, the noctograph was all forgotten, and carbon paper became carbon paper. Carbonated paper became carbon paper, and that eventually came into use in general correspondence for making copies of things. Older people may remember what it was like to make a carbon copy, and in fact, if you look at in email, you'll see you have the option for CC. Well, CC stands for carbon copy.
Right.
So what that meant, though, is that all of a sudden, after he died, he left behind his manuscript. Well, his manuscript didn't look like an original with ink and all. It looked like a carbon copy because it was a carbon, but it was a carbon original. And so what apparently happened, as far as I'm able to tell, is that people didn't understand this was an original manuscript. They thought it was a copy. And somehow, between his legacy and when the trail went completely cold, it was thrown away. Or like I said, it probably ended up in a chimney in Chiswick somewhere being burnt for warmth, which is just kind of sad. And I still hope to this day that someone will prove me wrong on that. So that was another case where, once again, your expectations of what you would think would be valued were not valued at all.
Well, it's sad to think what it's lost, but still it's heartening to see all the examples of his life that we do know. And this is where I like to come to what you think made him capable of doing all the things that he did. I mean, we're learning about his life. It even made me think about different problems in a different way. Not, well, I can't do this. This is too hard. But instead of thinking that way, think, well, James Holman would probably imagine, out of the infinite possibilities of what I can do, there is something I could do that would work. But okay, so what is that? And I'll just go for it. That's what I imagined he would do encountering a problem. But what do you think it was? What do you think made him so capable?
I think because we think about things as when you solve something into a solution, ta-da, it is done. So there's the idea of a, let's say, for example, you complete a jigsaw puzzle. It's like, oh, you have that achievement is done, and now the thing exists in some kind of finished state, which you then admire. His approach to problem solving was much more like, well, are you familiar with this technology of escape rooms nowadays? There's this trend
Oh,
where
yes.
there are escape rooms. Do you know what that is? Yeah. So
yes.
how people get paid perfectly good money to go get locked into a room somewhere, and they have to figure out what the puzzle is and how to get out of that room. Well, he made every single day kind of an escape room. Every day was a puzzle. He had to figure out how to get through it, how to get out of it, how to get out of the situation and into the next one. So rather than think that there was the stasis at the end of achievement, it was always a process. And that idea of that, I mean, and this is the interesting thing that people do, that they'll say, well, a really, really fascinating guy, but what did he actually do? What did he achieve in this life? And you got to look at it, it's like, well, I guess that's true. I mean, he did, help to go found a nation. He did help fight the slave trade. He did help chart the Australian outback, so on and so forth. But the reality is that the lasting legacy that he left isn't that enduring. But he was never trying to do that. When we say to solve problems, one thing that we do is we think that solutions equal achievement. But his whole idea was, this will make life more interesting. What can I do to keep life interesting? For him, boredom, complacency was literally toxic. So I've been inspired by the idea, not that he had this amazing supernatural ability or anything like that, but by the idea that complacency is toxic. And what can I do on a daily basis just to make it a little bit more interesting?
And he also has left behind a legacy in one program that I think was directly inspired by your book, which is the Holman Prize. And I'd love to hear about this and some of the recipients.
Oh yes. There is now the James Holman Prize. I believe that. Oh yeah, the full title of it is the Holman Prize for Blind Ambition, and I'm very, very excited by this. The Lighthouse for the Blind, which is a national organization, one of the largest organizations of advocacy training for the blind, a few years back have launched this thing called the Holman Prize. And anyone can go check it out at holman.org. And it's very fascinating because it is a series of 3 annual awards to underwrite the adventures of blind people doing something that has never before been done, or doing something that totally challenges people's perception of what it means to be blind. And it's just astonishing what they have done. Last year, one of the people that they underwrote was the first blind person to kayak from Africa to Europe, doing that completely solo, and the technology necessary for that. This year, one of the winners is going to be a blind person who's going to complete solo an ultra marathon. Or a triathlon, I think, or an ultra triathlon. I'm not quite sure. It's that impressive. But the audacious thing about this is that it celebrates audacity, and it does it in the name of James Holman. And what I find really interesting is that in order to apply, you have to submit a video. And one of the things they say is that it might be unusual for the idea of a blind person to, write and produce and star in a video. But if you get the concept of James Holman, you'll understand that that's simply the very first of the minor hurdles that you would have to overcome. So at the very beginning, just the idea that to apply for this, you have to write and produce and upload to YouTube where people can see your application video, and there are hundreds of them online, and it's very interesting to look at. So yeah, I really encourage people to go to holman.org and learn more about that. But what I'm very heartened by, Scott, is that Holman is returning to public consciousness. Because when I set out to write this book, I wrote it because I was just astonished that the book did not exist. And I thought, we have Helen Kellers of the world, and we have Ray Charleses of the world. Why do we not have the lesson of James Holman as part of our cultural heritage? How did that